assistance project. Mike works on issues related to power market design, integration of low carbon supply, systems planning, and demand response, splitting his time between RAP's US and Europe's teams. He has a long history and deep expertise in the electricity sector. Too long to list here, really, but it includes his work in the growth of leading US private power developer GMC, co-founding of private power developer Intergen, where he developed, financed, and operated 8,000 megawatts of greenfield power plants across the United Kingdom, Netherlands, India, Egypt, and Turkey. And Mike also headed up Centrica's North American affiliate Direct Energy's upstream gas and power businesses in Toronto. We'll go ahead and get started. Mike will present for about 20 minutes, followed by questions. Please type any of your questions to the organizer in the webinar chat function. We'll hold some content questions into the end, but we'll have 2 spots for any clarifying questions during the presentation. So please send any types of questions at any time, and we'll share them then. All the questions will be anonymous. Following the presentation, as I said, there'll be about 20 minutes for questions before we officially wrap up. But if there's any additional questions, Mike has agreed to stay around, and we can keep things going for about another 30 minutes until we get through any other questions that folks have. So without further delay, I'll turn things over to Mike to get us started.
Thanks, Sarah, and good morning or good afternoon, I guess, depending on where you are in Canada. Thanks for joining. I'll start by saying that the title of the webinar is maybe a skosh misleading. I'm going to assume, or we've decided to assume, that people on the call are familiar at least with the very basics of capacity markets, or at least most of the capacity markets. We talk about things like what the value of lost load is, what loss of load expectation is, how you develop a resource adequacy standard, and kind of the basic pieces of a demand curve in a capacity market. So we're assuming that people are familiar with those things. If anyone feels a burning need to have a refresher on any of that, please let the organizers know, and I'd be happy to revisit some of that. Anyway, with that as a caveat, let's go. So I want to start by talking about the objective of capacity markets, and make sure it's always good to know what it is actually you're trying to accomplish or what problem you're trying to solve. And basically, the thing I want to start with is that, it's good to remember that there are lots of ways actually to ensure resource adequacy. There's no single path to reliability, and each path comes with its own price tag. And so you really have to ask the question, how do you achieve that objective at least cost to consumers? And that becomes a particularly acute question in a low carbon power system, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And I would say that the objective stated in the AESO material that I've reviewed is laudable. It says that the desired end state is to develop a capacity market that ensures continued supply adequacy and reliability at a reasonable cost. And I added the, I think, fairly obvious addendum to that, at a reasonable cost to consumers. But I want to ask whether we think the proposal will deliver on all of those objectives, and they are all critical. They're all, each piece of that statement is as important as the other. Whether the proposal will deliver, especially in the emerging low-cost power system, low-carbon power system. And I think we like to say that the short answer is how much you need depends on what kind you have. This is a graphic or adapted from an IEA study that was published in 2014 called The Power of Transformation. And it looks at a hypothetical system. The top and the bottom graphs describe the same system with the same reliability standard, with the same shape and quantity of demand. The difference being that on the top, which we label as the legacy system, you've got a fairly traditional mix of thermal resources of base load, mid-merit, and peak, with the rest coming from renewables. The bottom in that same system You've got the same amount coming from renewables, but with what we refer to as a transformed mix of baseload, mid-merit, and peaking resources. Again, both systems achieving the same, meeting the same demand shape and quantity of demand to the same standard of reliability. In the top case, you end up with what is fundamentally an economically or financially unstable industry structure where the baseload plant is experiencing load factors in the sort of the low 60s, which for baseload generation is not a sustainable situation. Mid-merit plant is running at very low load factors, which is also not a sustainable situation, and peak is running the way peak normally runs. And this is the mantra that one often hears from the generation and the utility industry and from a lot of utility planners, that in a high renewable system, the generation investment in generation can become unsustainable. But in the bottom case, where the mix of resources has shifted to one that is less baseload intensive and has more mid-merit generation, more load following generation, you end up with that's interesting. You end up with utilization rates on plant that are much more familiar to owners of those different categories of plants. So you have a lot less baseload generation in terms of percentage of the capacity on the system, but what you have is operating the way one would normally expect baseload generation to operate at about a 96%, the mid to high 90s in terms of capacity utilization. Mid-merit load following generation, that's a lowish number. You're probably still not at an optimal generation mix there, but you're at a much more comfortable level than 11%. And then peak again is operating the way peak normally operates. The key really takeaway from this, however, is that not only are you moving in the direction of a much more sustainable, financially sustainable industry structure, but the difference in the amount of capital that needs to be invested in infrastructure, in generation and transmission infrastructure between these two scenarios can be as much as 40%. A very, very significant difference. And we can look at a representative analysis. This was done as part of what was called the Roadmap 2050 project that was McKinsey, Imperial College London, and KEMA from 2010. And they were doing a modeling exercise on a low carbon pathway in Europe. And this is just one of the regions. And this is the southern UK. This is in 2030, at which point they were projecting 28% of energy coming from variable renewables. And this is the blue is the gross demand on the system, very familiar curves, a set of curves for the year. And superimposed is a sort of a nominal breakdown of how much of that would end up, ideally being met by peaking plant, how much would be ideally met by load following or mid-merit plant, and how much would be met by baseload plant. However, given the fact that 28% of the energy that's meeting this demand is coming from variable renewables, which will usually be must-run because it's free energy, the net load looks quite different. It looks quite different, but again, how you feel about that kind of depends on who you are. Again, you've got a certain amount of it being met by peaking plant, and peaking plant is seeing utilization that is not unfamiliar. It's a little less predictable, but it's certainly not unfamiliar. Mid-merit, there's just a lot more of it. Again, its operating regime is not grossly unfamiliar to owners of mid-merit plant. Maybe a little less predictable, but utilization rates are what they are, and just a much smaller market space for baseload. There's still a need for baseload, but ideally much less of it. So if you look at the capacity market, which asks the question, how much do we need, and do we have it? The typical sort of classic look at it is a single clearing price auction, treating capacity as a single product, undifferentiated. This is from a report that we did a few years ago called "What Lies Beyond Capacity Markets." But the problem with this is it treats all capacity as having the same value, undifferentiated. And we've known for 50 years that that achieving a reliable system and achieving it at a reasonable cost requires a diversity of generation resources, of supply resources, and they don't all have the same value for reliability. This is the PJM capacity demand curve for their single product capacity market. So, you know, you're looking at something that's very familiar with a demand curve and a supply curve, and the supply curve clears at some point along the demand curve. This would be a capacity market. We call it a multiple clearing price auction capacity market that would address the fact that different types of capacity with different operational characteristics actually do make different values of contribution towards achieving the objective of a reliable system at the lowest reasonable cost to consumers. And you have capacity clearing in this auction in tranches, sequential tranches, with the highest value capacity clearing first, and to the extent that not enough capacity clears in the highest value category to meet the overall demand for capacity, you then have a second tranche with the second highest value of capacity, and then a third tranche, if necessary, with the third highest value capacity. And that presumably that third tranche would be inflexible baseload generation. And that might look terribly complicated, and gosh, why would you ever do that? Well, that's exactly the market structure that PJM originally proposed in 2005, where in their proposal to stakeholders and to FERC, this is what they said. Intent is to ensure ongoing system reliability through operational diversity. You can read it yourself. In order to encourage long-term operational diversity, long-term investment signals must include operational reliability constraints, blah, blah, blah. And that's kind of a fancy way of saying, look, we've actually identified 3 different types of generation. In this case, they were identifying base load, load following, and supplemental reserves. And we need to make sure that we have some of all of those in the mix of capacity that we're buying through the capacity market. And so we need to structure the capacity market to do that. And FERC concurred with PJM. We agree with PJM that the region must have at least a minimum amount of each of these capabilities. We conclude quick start and load following capabilities are characteristics of capacity, just as location is a characteristic of capacity. Now, you might say, well, what happened to that proposal? Well, the fact was that it didn't survive the stakeholder process. There was a lot of pushback about the need for whether or not there would be enough liquidity, and whether or not actually there was enough of an immediate need to take on that much complexity, and whether it was worth the cost. And PJM ended up compromising on this feature. However, it has come back into the discussions in PJM a number of times since then. And one would argue that as PJM is going more and more towards variable renewables on their system, the pressure to move towards something that is more explicitly recognize the value of diversity of capacity is going to become more pressing. And we'll talk in a minute about how they're going about doing that. And they actually did it. They actually implemented something like this in the demand response portion of the capacity option, where initially with demand response, they bought all demand response as an undifferentiated product. But within that undifferentiated product, there were in fact what they ended up categorizing as 3 different classes of demand response, each of which had different value in contributing to resource adequacy at the lowest reasonable cost. They referred to those as annual, extended summer, and limited. And they instituted a sequential, tranched auction process for that recognized those 3 different categories of demand response. And they actually did start to see price separation between the 3. This has now been subsumed into the new structure in PJM, which we won't go into a lot of detail because they've further evolved their capacity market to address some other issues. Although something like this is probably going to continue to be in place in PJM. But it's just a practical demonstration of the fact that this is something that actually has been done successfully and has produced valuable results in practice. I'll stop for a moment at that point to see if there are any clarifying questions out there. We probably want to hold substantive questions to the end, but if there's anything that anybody needs clarified at this point.
Yeah, so we had one clarifying question just on the last point. So what markets have this kind of multi-price capacity market structure now? I know you mentioned PJM since the question came in, but are there others?
PJM is the principal one, that's actually New York AESO does have a couple of different auction processes, but really PJM is the primary one. What has happened is in the capacity market, we'll talk about this in a minute, but the capacity markets have moved back towards very much a single product market structure, but one that places much greater degree of risk on generators for performing with very few excuses for non-performing and with very, very steep penalties for failure to perform, which during system stress hours, which has the effect of favoring or providing an economic advantage to more flexible generation and a disadvantage to less flexible generation. Demand response is now being treated very differently. It's still allowed to participate, but in terms of capacity markets, I think probably appropriately so, capacity markets are now saying, look, it's not enough to just be available during the summer peak, and in the case of PJM, which is a summer peaking system, it has to be available year-round whenever we need it. This was in response to the polar vortex in 2014. And so demand response, what demand response can now participate in PJM is only the annual demand response. They're going to hold a separate procurement process for more seasonal demand response. So that's a long-winded answer to the question.
Great, so we had one more clarifying question, and then I think one you'll address later on. The clarifying one was, where does supply cross demand in the first and second tranches on slide 13?
So the first tranche clears at call it the $70 per megawatt hour, or $70 per megawatt day, I think is the metric. And then they ran out of that was all the annual that bid. So that cleared at the $70 level. Then they had the second tranche, which was summer extended, and that cleared at, say, the $60 level. And then they had the third tranche, which filled out all of their demand for demand response, and that cleared at the $50 level. So each tranche had a different clearing price. So if you were able to provide annual demand response, you got paid $20 more than if you only were able to provide limited. So there are three different clearing prices.
And were these examples is this example for a one-year capacity commitment or a different term?
Yeah, PJM has a one-year term.
Okay, well, I think that's all the questions that we have for clarifying, so we can move on.
Okay, we'll move on. So in addition to different ways of ensuring resource adequacy, there are different ways to pay for it. And of course, that takes us to a discussion about capacity markets versus energy markets and other ancillary services markets and so on and so forth. Again, how to do so at least cost to consumers, especially as we move towards a low carbon power system. So let's talk about the capacity market and the energy market as vehicles for paying for the resources needed to meet resource adequacy. I'm going to start with a kind of a bald statement, which is that capacity and energy are not separate products. How do we know this? Well, there are lots of ways we know it, but one way is that in existing capacity markets, The demand curve is not based on gross cost of new entrants. It's based on a net cost of new entrant. What does that mean? That means that the demand curve is constructed by taking the gross cost, in other words, the total levelized investment cost for a new entrant, and that could be a combustion turbine, it could be a combined cycle plant, whatever, and subtracting from that the margins that that plant would be expected to earn in the energy and ancillary services markets. In other words, capacity markets are by design, assume that capacity is actually remunerated by energy and ancillary services markets. So capacity, if you want to call it that, it's actually, I mean, to be frank, what it really is fixed costs. It's simply a component of the energy value chain in the same way that, you know, harvesting equipment is a component in the tomato value chain. A capacity market should be a belts and braces backstop to the energy and ancillary services market. It's not a replacement for it. It doesn't serve a separate purpose. It simply backstops the energy and ancillary services markets in the event that they are not adequately remunerating needed investment in capacity resources. The better you do on energy price formation or energy and ancillary services markets price formation, the less you need to rely on a capacity market, and the more transparent the value of investments in resource flexibility. And we've talked about resource flexibility and the importance of attracting a portfolio or a diversity of resources, and as we move towards a low carbon power system, a more flexible mix of system resources. This is a graph from the Brattle report that was done as part of the ERCOT investigation of whether or not to adopt a capacity market. And you'll see yourselves there. There's Alberta on the left. It's a comparison of average weekly energy prices in 6 markets. The 3 on the left are markets that rely on energy and ancillary services markets to a great extent, if not entirely, as drivers of decisions on investment, distribution, and consumption. The 3 on the right have all adopted different forms of capacity markets outside of the energy and ancillary services markets. And the simple sort of takeaway from this graph is that the swings between high and low prices in the markets on the left are the picture of the value of flexibility. There is no other way to describe the value of flexibility than the value of being able to contribute to the system when the supply of energy and network capacity is dear, and to either postpone consumption or consume and store for later use through things like electric storage water heaters, ice storage, air conditioning, refrigeration, electric vehicles, and so on and so forth, heat pumps, at times when the supply of energy and network capacity is plentiful. And the prices tell you that. If we look at the practical consequences of that in a high renewables or high variable renewable system, we look at the critical role, increasingly critical role that demand response or flexible demand is going to have to play or should play if we want to get to a low cost transition. And what we see here is that the purple line is the unaffected or natural demand curve for a week. This is a representative week in the summer at some point in the future when there's, as you see, quite a bit of variable renewable production on the system. The red line being what you would like demand to do in response to less controllable fluctuations in the availability of supply. And this is quite a realistic portrayal. This assumes only 10% of the daily consumption on the system is movable from one time of the day to another. And particularly if you're in a system with a lot of electrified transport and heat, that is a very modest assumption. But the value of doing that is best expressed through time of use or real-time pricing. And to the extent that on the right, you suck that out of the market, it becomes much more difficult to communicate to and reward end users from adapting themselves or responding to supply and demand conditions in the market in the same way that anybody would respond to supply and demand conditions in any other commodity market. So regardless of whether you have a capacity market or not, and the UK is a wonderful example. In the UK, they adopted a capacity market. At the same time, they adopted exactly the same mechanism that was adopted in ERCOT, which is effectively an operating reserve demand curve. It's slightly different to reflect the specific characteristics of the GB market. But alongside it, they've adopted an ORD, an operating reserve demand curve, which is what ERCOT uses to make sure that needed investment in capacity is being properly remunerated. And they are going to continue, as is PJM, by the way, to refine price formation in their energy and ancillary services markets to achieve this sort of outcome. And along the way, in doing so, minimize the extent to which they have to rely on a much cruder and less refined price signal from the capacity markets to pay for the investment that they need to meet the reliability standard. Let's talk about delivery period or term for a moment. And there's a lot of talk about this and everywhere you go, and when the capacity market discussion comes up, either before or, and much more interestingly, after capacity markets are adopted, which is, gosh, is a year enough? Who would make an investment based on having, revenue assurance only for a year? And should it be a year for existing capacity, but 5 years or 8 years or 15 years for new capacity? And the answer, both from theory and from practice, long practice, is that the term should be the term. If you are a capacity provider, whether you're an existing capacity provider or a new capacity provider, the capacity market should provide a delivery period or a commitment period that is the same for everybody. If all capacity is the same, or all providers of a certain kind of capacity are the same, then they should all receive the same treatment in the market. And that is unassailable. Anything else is by definition a distortion. And experience tells us that the term is the term, and it should be short. And we'll talk about why. So the AESO, again, in the material that I've reviewed, says the right thing, and this is why we adopted markets in the first place. Long-term investment risks should continue to be largely borne, and I added the caveat, or rather managed, by investors rather than by consumers. When you read through all the theoretical and practical literature, the bottom line is that the main benefit that we seek to realize from adopting competitive markets in the wholesale energy market is to properly, where it is proper to do so, to shift long-term investment risks away from consumers and back to investors in the same way that investment risks are borne in by investors in most other commodities markets. Bilateral contracts and financial hedging remain the principal basis for investment, even where there are capacity markets. And again, if we want to look at PJM, it's been operating for a decade now. It still offers 1 year, sequential 1 year commitment periods for existing and new capacity. And PJM market has been wildly successful in attracting new investment. And anybody who's ever spent time investing in large power plants, as I did spend about 25 years, would tell you that having 1 year of certainty 3 years in advance about what your price is going to be isn't any much more of a firm foundation on which to make a $500 million investment than having no certainty 3 years into the future for 1 year about what your price is going to be. Does it help? PJM would argue it does. A lot of people would argue it does. It gives some level of comfort that you have some knowledge in advance of what you're going to get paid. But if the market needs new investment, the market is going to have to find ways through bilateral contracts and financing instruments, hedging instruments, as the principal basis for those investments. It's worked very well in PJM. It's worked very well in ERCOT, which doesn't have a capacity market. It's worked very well in AESO New England, which has capacity markets with slightly longer commitment periods available as an option to new investment. But as we see from this graph, and this is a complicated graph and I won't spend a lot of time on it, what we see here is that if you look across those markets, that a range of markets where capacity markets, well, in the case of ERCOT, they've not adopted a capacity market, and then the rest have. And they are arranged in ascending order of the sort of the extensiveness to which the capacity market intervenes. So New York ISO has a capacity market, but it only looks 6 months out in advance and provides a 1-year commitment period for both existing and new. PJM looks 3 years in advance, provides a 1-year commitment for existing and new. ISO New England looks 3 years in advance, provides a 1-year commitment for existing, and up to a 5-year period for new. It's now up to 8 years, but the period covered by this, it was really it was the 5-year option that was relevant. The NEM in Australia has no capacity market, whereas the Southwest Interconnected System has a PJM style, a New York ISO style capacity market. The bar charts on the left show the average amount of annual investment in new build as a percentage of the 2014 peak load. So it gives a sense of the rate at which those markets, over the period that they've been competitive wholesale markets, have attracted new investment relative to the rate at which they needed to attract new investment. It's not a perfect or comprehensive metric, but it's a representative metric. And there's no obvious pattern there of advantage or disadvantage emerging from any one of those particular choices of market design. On the right is a graphic that shows the ratio of actual to target reserve margins in those markets, with the red dotted line being the target reserve margin in each of them, and then for each of them the actual reserve margin in 2015. And what you see there is quite a clear pattern that emerges, that the more intrusive the capacity intervention is into the market, the more there's a tendency to over-procure resources. And from an economic efficiency and consumer interest perspective, that is not a good deal. It may make you sleep better at night thinking that there's almost no chance that you're going to have a reliability problem, although that's also not an accurate conclusion, but that's another discussion. But it certainly is buying far more resources than you yourself have said you need to meet consumers' expectation for reliability. So that is just, and then this is another graphic. This was an analysis that Brattle did of PJM's peak demand forecasts that they've used in each of their capacity market auctions since 2007. And I would argue that PJM is a pretty darn sophisticated system operator, maybe one of the most sophisticated in the world. Certainly one of the most sophisticated at operating a competitive wholesale market. And they also don't have any particular financial interest in overbuilding the system. They don't have any financial interest in overbuilding the system. And yet, even PJM, every single year, has overestimated the growth in peak demand. And that this goes back to before the recession, during the recession, and after this recession. And what that tells you is that if the idea of markets is to take from consumers' shoulders the burden of trying to understand what the market's going to need and committing to pay for it, 15, 20, 30 years into the future. Consumers in PJM would today be paying for a heck of a lot more capacity than they actually need to meet their expectation for reliability. So all of these to say basically that that the term of commitment periods in capacity markets based on the evidence can be, based on the theory should be, limited. And experience would suggest that sequential one-year periods work just fine, particularly as long as you do the work to try to get the transparency of energy and ancillary services pricing as close to right as possible. And there is certainly no theoretical or practical reason why one should be treating existing resources differently from new resources. And now, just quickly moving to a close, if we look at kind of across the patch of how things have kind of moved over time, it's interesting to see against these two models, market-driven, time-varying remuneration of capacity resources versus administrative fixed payments. Oh, what happened? So we implemented these markets, and they were, call them simple energy-only markets. Then people started to, at various junctures for various reasons, adopt fixed single product capacity markets, undifferentiated capacity value. We started to see more sophistication in the energy markets with ancillary services auctions of various types, which starts to move a little bit away from just relying on energy-only markets. We saw limited segmentation, as I talked about, of certain parts of the capacity market in some places. Now both PJM and AESO New England have moved back toward a single product market because of the concerns with the way that capacity was being rewarded, incentivized under the previous structure, with major shifts in the obligations and the risk exposure to capacity providers against their ability to perform during scarcity events at any time of the year when that might be required. And in the more aggressive energy-only markets, and certainly we'll cite ERCOT being maybe one of the better examples, we've seen the adoption, instead of adopting fixed out-of-energy market capacity mechanisms, the adoption of an administrative mechanism called a reserve. They call it an operating reserve demand curve. I generically refer to it as a reserve shortage pricing intervention, where the system operator is empowered to apply price adders in the energy market to the extent that the market is not adequately reflecting the value of reserves and energy under scarcity events. And then, long term, once demand is truly able to respond broadly to supply and demand conditions on the market, we could see on the market driven side, a true sort of, kind of fully functioning commodity market. Or on the administrative fixed side, some markets are moving in the direction of having a pure energy, having a well-structured energy and ancillary services market, but maintaining a strategic reserve on the side. So this is kind of some of the, if you look across the patch, this is kind of the evolution you're seeing. I don't know if there are any clarifying questions at this point before I go to my closing remarks.
Yeah, we had two. The first was, how much of PJM's market is in bilateral versus how much is in the capacity market?
I don't have a quick answer to that question, but I would suspect it's a fair amount, but it's probably not half. Or put it this way, generators, and again, I'm just giving you my experience, generators quite often will hedge their investments in generation with a portfolio of risk management arrangements, some of which may be a tolling arrangement with of 5, 10, or in the most extreme case maybe 15 years, some of which may be 1-year forward contracts, some of which may be seasonal contracts, and some portion of it may be spot. Those would show up, those generators would show up as not being under bilateral contracts in the PJM capacity market construct. But in fact, they have hedged their exposure through a range of commercial undertakings with willing counterparties. And that, I would say, most generation in PJM would fit under that description. What's the second one?
And the second one is actually now two, but they're related. So one asking you to expound on why existing assets would receive the same capacity payments as new. And then related, why does New England differentiate for existing 1 year and new assets up to 7 years in the capacity market?
Well, if you, I'll try to give a short answer to the first question, which is, if you think through the implications of treating capacity providers bidding into a capacity auction for the first time differently from capacity providers that have been bidding into the capacity auctions in previous years, which is basically what you're saying when you say you're going to treat new generation differently, and that's the way it's structured in AESO New England, for instance. You start to run into some very basic practical problems. And the UK capacity market anticipated this by saying, the UK market actually said, we are going to, for the first auction or few auctions, we are going to offer new generators who bid in, and they were expecting 1 or 2 new generators to bid in, a 15-year commitment period. But that will only be offered for once the first wave of new investment clears the capacity market, that will no longer be available, because they looked at they thought it through and realized that you go down that road and you end up ghettoizing existing capacity into a segment of the market where prices are where the revenues are not as certain as the generator that just bid into the auction, and yet many of those generators, some of those generators might have just been built a couple of years ago. They've got exactly the same capital structure as the guy that's just bidding in for the first time, and yet they're getting treated differently. And if you maintain that, if you're always going to say, I'm going to give new generators a different deal than existing generators, you're going to very quickly end up finding yourself in a situation where existing generators increasingly find it difficult to survive in the market, and what you've got is a market where all of your generation is locked in under 15-year contracts, in which case you've now reverted to what is basically a central planning system, where consumers are once again exposed to the sorts of risks that I illustrated with that Brattle Group graph of just how far wrong central administrators, system operators can get something as basic as a peak demand forecast, especially as in the environment that we're in now. Someone said in a forum that I was at just recently, and I love this quote, they said, you guys are talking about business as usual. At this stage in the industry, business as usual is the least likely outcome. And that is absolutely true. And what was the second question?
That was it. The two were together around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we can go ahead and move on that.
So
we have a couple of other questions.
So we'll have. All right. So I'll just go quickly to the parting thoughts then. The objective of it, how much depends on what kind. We talked about that. The objective of any resource adequacy mechanism is reliability at the lowest reasonable cost. That has important implications for the design of a capacity market and for its proper role. Energy and capacity are not separate products. Effective energy and balancing markets are essential to valuing investments in flexibility and spurring innovation, especially on the demand side. administrative remedies should target them as well, or should target them rather than simply paying for capacity outside of them. And finally, capacity markets are not PPA markets, nor are they new investment markets. There's no evidence that capacity markets offering multi-year terms to investments are more effective. Doing so heavily distorts the market and contravenes the risk allocation for which markets were adopted in the first place. And with that, we'll move to questions.
Great. So please continue to send your questions, and we'll go through the ones that we have already. So one question was, how does storage enter into capacity markets?
You know, that's a good question, and a lot of capacity markets are really struggling with that. And the simplest answer is that storage certainly, actually, storage is pure capacity. It's actually not energy, because of course storage doesn't generate any energy. It simply stores it and then releases it. So storage can provide capacity in a capacity market and should be allowed to do so. But it should be subject to exactly the same, just as has been happening with demand response in the PJM and AESO New England markets, that storage should be subject to the same performance obligations and financial risks that any other capacity is. And furthermore, personally, I would question the extent to which people pursuing a storage business model really want to get all that much involved in capacity markets. Because in many cases, it would be my view that committing to provide capacity and provide it at a very high level of reliability and provide it whenever a scarcity event occurs is really not the highest value way to use storage in the first place. It in effect obligates you to refrain from using your storage during many hours when it could actually be very profitable to do so, in anticipation of the opportunity to and the obligation to be ready to run for a scarcity event. So, I mean, I think most people would say I think that storage should be allowed to play. There are ways to make it possible for storage to play. It should be subject to the same obligations and the same risks, and then leave it to storage to decide whether that's the business model they want to pursue.
Great. We have another one that I think you touched on a bit, but Elise Kaplan of America's Public Power Association published a document in December of 2015 stating that, quote, capacity markets do not incent new generation, end quote. Would you agree with her?
I wouldn't be quite that absolute about it, but I think that capacity markets in and of themselves certainly don't incent new investment. And the new investment takes place based on a cocktail of commercial and commercial arrangements and investment and business models, revenue models, cost models, financing strategies, and if you look at capacity markets in practice, in markets that have throughout the period attracted a considerable amount of new investment, and I'm talking about PJM and AESO New England and New York AESO, those capacity markets have consistently cleared at or near the floor prices, very, very low prices, very small piece of revenue for providers of capacity, certainly nowhere near what it would take to support either in amount or in nature to support what it would take to invest $500 million in a new power plant. And yet investment has taken place. Did capacity markets help? Maybe. I don't know. I mean, we've also seen a lot of investment, more than enough investment, if you want to know the truth, in the NEM market in Australia and in the ERCOT market in Texas. Would a capacity market have helped them a little bit? Perhaps. But the capacity in all of those markets, the investments in capacity have taken place for a whole host of reasons, only a small piece of which would be explained by the capacity market itself. One thing a capacity market can do, and I will freely admit this, is it can give investors a little more confidence that at least for 1 year at a time every year, to the extent that the energy and ancillary services markets don't live up to expectations, that their revenues will be supplemented to the extent they need to be to recognize the value of what they're contributing to resource adequacy. So it probably adds a fillip of added sort of investor confidence that wouldn't exist otherwise. But like I say, you can look at the NEM market in Australia and the ERCOT market, and you have to ask yourself what it tells you, that they have been perfectly capable of meeting and exceeding their target reserve margins without capacity markets.
So we had a question about customers, so one question that was sort of general, what about customers? And now a second related, what is the best way to charge capacity to load?
Well, I mean, that's a question that you could apply both for generation capacity and network capacity, and we think about those questions a lot. And at the end of the day, and then there's the question of how on networks is how much network capacity cost should be allocated to load versus allocated to generators, but that's a whole different question. But as a broad principle, we feel that that the capital costs associated with the infrastructure needed to meet the demand for electricity, that those capital costs, that the capital costs that should be recovered as a standing charge, a flat fixed charge, are the capital costs specifically associated with each particular customer's service. So from the line drop to the meter, and the subtransformer associated with it. And that the rest of the cost of the system to be done fairly should be charged to consumers based on the extent to which they use them, and ideally when they use them. So time varying, and to some extent locational. The networks companies, and the generators should be rewarded through, to the greatest extent possible, volumetric charging, and that volumetric charging should reflect from 1 hour to the next, whether the system is heavily or lightly loaded, whether generation is scarce or plentiful, because we're entering into a period now going forward where more and more of generation is going to be less and less controllable, and we are going to need consumers, whether residential, industrial, or commercial, who are in a position to do so, and for the moment we're talking about consumers with large controllable loads like multi-unit housing with central electric water heating, or large commercial facilities with commercial refrigeration, or people who own electric vehicles, or people who own behind the meter production like solar panels or small diesels. That we need to make sure that they have all the incentives they need to respond to real-time conditions of surplus and scarcity on the system. And just like in any other commodity market, to the extent that you can and should, you should recover those costs through time-varying volumetric costs and charges. The only fixed costs that are specific to each customer and that are driven by each customer's non-coincident peak demand are the costs of the equipment needed to serve that customer off of the distribution feeder. The rest of those charges are properly recovered through to the greatest extent possible volumetric charging.
Okay. So we have a few questions about energy efficiency measures and renewable energy. So how do you see or can energy efficiency measures such as load reduction or renewable energy such as wind, solar, and hydro participate in capacity markets, and how?
The general answer has been yes in both cases. Renewables are allowed to participate in the capacity markets in AESO New England and PJM and New York AESO, as are demand response and energy efficiency. As I said, the rules across the board are changing or have changed in AESO New England and PJM to this pay-for-performance structure. So it's a little more difficult for demand response and renewables to participate, although in the case of PJM, I think also in the case of AESO New England, but you'd have to check me on this, demand response both demand response and energy efficiency are allowed to submit compound bids where they combine together to provide a firm capacity product. The first energy efficiency, as it turns out, actually can perform very well against the new pay performance standards. And if you look at this past year's PJM auction, which was the first one in which they measured on these new criteria, they didn't impose the obligations, but they measured capacity bids into the auction against these pay for performance criteria and found that while something like 80% of energy efficiency that was bid into the auction was what they call capacity performance qualified, only about 20% of demand response that bid in was capacity performance qualified, and that wasn't surprising because a lot of the demand response that had been clearing through the PJM capacity market for the previous 10 years was seasonal demand response. It was designed to respond to what the capacity market was asking for, which was firm capacity at summer peak. The new pay for performance rules mean that demand response is going to have to find a way to either be annual, to be available year-round, or to develop a different business model. So yeah, the answer is that to the extent that renewables, and renewables, of course, I mean, as we all know, renewables, their firm capacity value is lower on average than it is for thermal plant. And that'll vary depending on where you are and what kind of technology you have. But they do have some capacity value, and to the extent they do, they've been allowed to bid into capacity markets. We've always said that while from a capacity market, from a consumer's perspective, and from a capacity market design perspective, you absolutely should make sure that anybody who can provide capacity or capacity equivalents consistent with the requirements should be allowed to bid, no question. And that should include energy efficiency, it should include demand response, and it should include renewables. From a renewables and a demand response business owner's perspective, one should not bet the farm on being able to make your money back through selling your product as capacity, because capacity markets are moving away from a model that would make them particularly lucrative for variable renewables or demand response. And even in the case of energy efficiency, energy efficiency can perform very well against the new capacity performance requirements, but the fact of the matter is that the other requirements that are imposed in most capacity markets make it difficult for a lot of very cost-effective energy efficiency to participate. And there are a lot of values to energy efficiency that cannot be recovered. in the capacity market. And so while it's important to consumers to make sure that energy efficiency that can qualify is allowed to bid, from an energy efficiency investors' perspective, it will almost always constitute a very small percentage of their revenues.
All right. So I know we're sort of at the top of the hour, but we still have quite a number of questions. So if folks haven't had their question answered or want to stick around and hear some answers, let's do so. Next one is somewhat related to that one you just answered, which is, have any of the capacity markets dealt with incorporating subsidies or out-of-market renewables? If so, how and what are best practices? And related, how do you see the capacity market in Alberta then working with the contract for differences model recently adopted for renewable power?
That's a complicated legal question to some extent, and it gets into question. It's a market design, but also a legal question. I mean, it gets into questions of. Yeah,
maybe let's focus more on the market design piece of it.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, they're related, but it's a legal question to the extent that it's been litigated in courts. But the capacity for the capacity market, and this touches on the new versus existing as well. But for capacity markets to do what they're supposed to do, which is to express from one auction period to another what the incremental value of capacity or different categories of capacity is, and the extent to which it's not being remunerated in the energy and ancillary services markets. For the capacity market to do that, all capacity needs to have a more or less equal opportunity to participate. And consumers across the market, if they're going to benefit from that equally, need to have confidence that that's the case. To the extent that that's bidding into the capacity market is benefiting to a given extent from efforts by state governments or whoever to use ratepayer or taxpayer money in their particular service area to provide an economic advantage to that capacity bidding into that market. What's been done in the PJM and AESO cases is that system operators have been allowed to adjust those capacity bids to reflect the fact that they are not bidding in their actual cost of providing that capacity. So they mark up those capacity bids to reflect whatever subsidies they're receiving. And I will admit here that I won't be able to quote chapter and verse to how that works with renewables, except to say that in principle it's how it's done. I know that in the case of conventional generation that bids into the Eastern AESO RTO markets, they have adopted with FERC approval what's called the minimum offer price rule, where capacity that is bidding into those markets that is benefiting from some sort of an out-of-market subsidy is marked up to reflect that subsidy. And it's been controversial, and there are a lot of stakeholders who don't like that, and think that it is biased against certain stakeholders in those markets. But to preserve, the market purity of the capacity market, that's the way they've done it. They don't prohibit that capacity from bidding in, but they mark it up to reflect the fact that it's subsidized.
Okay, we have some more questions. If capacity markets don't raise the price of power and remove the volatility of power prices, where is the investment advantage or the value of a capacity market for generators?
Well, capacity without if capacity markets are used to, whether or not a capacity market raises the price of power to consumers is an interesting question. I mean, if it's working as the theory would say it should work, then yes, it will raise it should raise the price of power to consumers to the extent that consumers were paying a price of power that reflected wholesale costs that weren't fully reflecting the value that consumers place on investments in reliability. So yes, to that extent, if a capacity market's working the way it should work, it should raise the price of power to some extent to consumers, but only as much as is needed and no more to top up what consumers are not paying through the energy and ancillary services markets and should be paying. Again, I say should be paying to reflect the fact that consumers, or at least we impute to consumers, a certain expectation of reliability, and that expectation comes at a cost that includes both energy and both variable costs and fixed costs. Now, so capacity markets can also, some people believe, and with good reason, that capacity markets rarely work exactly the way they're supposed to, and quite often you end up double paying. So capacity markets end up paying for money that it turns out that the generators are also managing to some extent to earn through the energy ancillary services markets. So it actually may raise consumer prices too much. But yeah, I mean, it's, to the, it can raise and does raise consumer prices on average. The cost of capacity market auctions is allocated to load in all the capacity markets, so that is an increase in prices to consumers, it within the course of the delivery period, it can reduce volatility to some extent. And from a generator investor's perspective, that's an incremental benefit. From a system of market efficiency and a low cost to consumers perspective, that is not a benefit. It's a penalty, or it's an inefficiency in the market that we end up paying for by perhaps ending up with a mix of resources that is not well suited to the underlying needs of the system. But so there's a small benefit in terms of, if you look at the PJM capacity market, for instance, that 1 year at a time, 3 years into the future, every year, you will have a bit more confidence as to what you're going to get paid for your energy, for your plant, and that is an incremental benefit. But it's not enough in and of itself to underpin an investment in a brand new power plant, nor should it be. There are commercial alternatives, as we talked about during the presentation. There are commercial alternatives, or should be commercial alternatives. If there's a need for new investment, there should be commercial alternatives available in the bilateral contracts market and in the forward hedging market for investors to be able to lay off the risks that they have to manage in ways that make sense overall in the market. And again, if we go to the NEM market in Australia, or we go to the ERCOT market in Texas, we see that that's actually how it works, and it seems to work pretty well. And if we look at the PJM market, or the AESO New England market, or the New York ISO market, or now the emerging GB capacity market in the UK, we see that investment in generation, even though it does, there is this dollop of somewhat predictable income from capacity markets, finds other options available to them of various kinds to provide the basis for financing of new investments in generation. So, as I said during the presentation, I'm not going to sit here and say that capacity markets don't provide any benefit to investors in generation. I'm sure there are lots of generators who would say that they more than appreciate what little additional help the capacity markets give them. Although most of them, as a former generator, I would expect almost all of them to say, gosh, we'd love it to be more. And who wouldn't? Everyone loves to make sure to use someone else's money to manage risks. But I don't think any of them would say that it's enough, and they probably will never say it's enough, no matter how far out you extend it. But it helps. They will probably say it helps a little bit, and it contributes to, as I described it before, a cocktail of arrangements that generators, investments in generation, will look at as a way of creating a revenue model and a financing strategy for new investment in generation.
We have a question about a specific market. Do you have any understanding of Mexico's capacity market? I understand at a very high level they provide optionality of contract length and a different capacity penalty charge.
Yeah, I would not present myself as somebody who could answer more than about a half a question on the Mexican capacity market. Apologize for that.
Okay. Some questions about alternatives again. So in achieving resource adequacy, can you address how a long-term contract might be better or worse than a capacity plus energy plus ancillary services market? And related, would it not be more effective to incent better storage and load following technologies under an energy market and not at a capacity market?
Well, I think you know my answer to that question, which is that an energy market that provides good price signals, energy and ancillary services market that provides good price signals, possibly assisted by, and I have no problem with this at all. I'm a big fan of it. Assisted by, for as long as necessary or whenever necessary, an administrative price adder when the market's is not reflecting the full demand for both energy and and reliability services is perfectly capable of attracting not just investment, but the right mix of investment in resources, capacity resources, with a suitable mix of capacity resource capabilities, and at the same time maximizing the information available to innovators on the demand side and to consumers on the demand side to take advantage of the opportunities created by periods of surplus and to avoid the risks associated with periods of scarcity. And in doing so, in turn, neutralizing some of the volatility that would otherwise exist in a market that is experiencing more and more periods of swings between scarcity and surplus, and is doing so without any responsiveness by customers to those periods. So, I think the less one shifts one's focus to payments for capacity outside of the energy ancillary services markets, and the more one focuses on making sure the energy ancillary services markets are working as well as they should, I think is the more efficient long-term resource adequacy solution, and one that preserves a fair and equitable allocation of risks between consumers and investors. And I have no problem, actually, I may have a little problem, but I have no problem, for instance, as has been done in the UK, putting in place alongside of that as a belts and bracers measure, a capacity mechanism that once, every year, every 6 months, every 2 years, looks out, assesses whether or not the market is performing as it should, and to the extent it's not, even though you've done all of these things to improve the performance of the energy ancillary services market price formation, you're suddenly looked out and you forecast, you're seeing the risk an unacceptable level of risk that you may fall below your meeting your reliability standard, gives you an option for compensating capacity providers to address that issue. And getting back to the new versus existing thing, quite often, and this is what happened in the first 3 rounds of auctions in the UK, quite often what you're going to find is that there are existing capacity providers who, with some incremental investment, will be in a position to actually increase the amount of firm capacity they can offer, and will do so, and you'll solve your capacity problem at a fraction of the cost of building a new power plant. And I can give you a concrete example of a plant that I had down in the Houston Ship Channel a number of years ago. Now, this is in the ERCOT market, so we're talking about the responsive reserves product, or the spinning reserves product. We were able to, this was a 800 megawatt gas-fired combined cycle plant, providing steam to a petrochemical facility. And with a $5 million investment, we were able to boost the amount of responsive reserve we could provide to the ERCOT market by a considerable amount, much more cheaply than it would have cost to for some of the alternatives. It would have required a new greenfield investment, and that's that's the right market solution. Anyway, that's a long-winded answer to that question.
I have a couple about some of the details. So in markets with operating capacity markets, what types of new generation do you see/find? And also in capacity markets, are different prices and capacities bid per hour, per day, or per region?
Well, the first question, I mean, and that's a really interesting question, and it's one of the areas where again we get back to this problem of treating all capacity as having equal value. What you see in almost all the capacity markets is that what tends to clear the market is combustion turbines and combined cycle plants. Although interestingly, in the GB market in the UK, almost everything that's cleared so far has been small dirty diesel plants, partially because they neglected to change the environmental regulations on small diesels to require them to meet the same standards as a generator supplying capacity to the market as anyone else that supplies capacity to the market. So these small dirty diesels enjoy certain special treatment because they're small and because they're imposing very onerous emissions requirements on them for something that operates only a couple hundred hours a year. Traditionally didn't make sense. But if they're going to be providing capacity to the market as a matter of course, they should have amended the environmental regulations for diesels operating in that mode, so that they had to meet the same standards. They didn't, and so guess what? Everything that's been clearing in the UK market has been small dirty diesels, and it's been a big problem for them. But anyway, so other capacity markets, the stuff that's tended to clear is combustion turbines and combined cycle plants, and one could quite reasonably ask whether or not, long run, that's the right solution. Don't you equally need a diversity of capacity resources, including demand side resources? And I think the answer is yes. And the way, again, that that capacity markets can achieve that is through these quota systems, or tranching of what bids into the auction based on desirable capacity resource capabilities. And in the simplest form, you look at the PJM original PJM proposal from 2005, they wanted to, they said we need to have a mix of base load, load following, and supplemental reserves, and we want to structure the capacity market to do that. Now, they were prevented from doing so. They've repeatedly over the years tried to find ways to bring that back in. Another way to go about it, so you might say, well, rather than saying I want a mix of base load, load following, and supplemental reserves, you might say I want fuel diversity. As a policymaker, as a system operator, you might quite reasonably say that I need fuel diversity in my capacity mix. I might want some nuclear. I might want, to buy some more wind and solar because, I want to reduce my dependency on imported natural gas, for instance. And again, respecting concerns, and you always have to respect concerns about liquidity. You can subdivide the capacity market to reflect what I would argue are quite reasonable concerns associated with diversity of resources. I wouldn't advocate going beyond that. I think there, for instance, environmental attributes, I think there are other ways to deal with that, whether it's through carbon cap and trade or through, particulate emission controls and so on and so forth. But for things that actually apply to the objective the capacity market is designed to achieve, which is reliable security of supply at the lowest reasonable cost to consumers, there are ways you can address that, and they are not addressed by treating all capacity as having exactly the same value.
Great, so we have 3 more questions. Hopefully we can fit in just in the last 2 minutes or so here. First is, Alberta's forward market is incredibly illiquid compared to those of the East. Since bilateral contracts and forward hedging are a significant part of the success of the Eastern U.S. markets, will that mean that more of the cocktail will need to come in the form of longer-term contracts from the AESO?
The experience both in markets with and without capacity markets has been that when the market is fully supplied or oversupplied with resources, the forward market does dry up. And when you start to see the market getting tight, and you start to see the onset of demand for new investment, you start to see the market beginning to become more liquid, especially if, and certainly this is this needs to be factored into market design, especially if you make sure that that consumers or the customer side of the wholesale market are exposed to exactly the same risks that the generators are exposed to in terms of the possibility of higher prices in the future or more price volatility, the very things you would expect as you begin to see the onset of a need for new investment. And as long as everybody in the market is seeing the same thing, if you really actually do need new investment, you will, and the experience in not just the Eastern AESO RTO markets, but also in the ERCOT market and the NEM market in Australia, the experience has been that the liquidity, you start to see liquidity increasing. We're seeing that in the European markets as well. So I would, I will venture to guess. I'm not well versed in exactly what the supply and demand situation is in the Alberta market, but I would venture to guess that the primary reason that you don't see any liquidity in the future market in Alberta is because at the moment Alberta is probably pretty well served by capacity, and there's not a burning need for new investment in capacity. I could be wrong about that, and if I am, I apologize.
All right, 2 more questions. So could a capacity market successfully survive increasingly stringent carbon reducing policies?
Sure, why not? I mean, carbon reducing policies, the market will need what capacity the market needs. I mean, you're going to do what you can do on energy efficiency and industrialized economies are seeing, a slow decline in the energy intensity of economic growth. But at the end of the day, the market's going to need what the market needs in the form of capacity. And if you are, if you're imposing the cost of the externality of carbon on energy resources, if there's a competition at the margins, you're increasing the likelihood that the lower carbon option will outcompete the higher carbon option. So that's at the margins, at the end of the merit order curve. For everything else, it's going to clear the market. The market will clear where the market needs to clear to get the capacity. If the investments are more costly, or if you need to recover more, and it's actually not usually through investments, it's actually through the energy costs. But if investors need to recover more because they have costs imposed on them because of carbon markets or carbon taxes, you will see that reflected in clearing prices in the capacity market. And to take an interesting example, which is being driven by a different consideration, if you look at what's happened in the Eastern AESO RTO markets in the past couple of years, with the onset of the pay-for-performance mechanisms, the new market designs for those capacity markets, as I said earlier, are imposing much more stringent performance obligations and much more extreme financial exposure, risk exposure to generators, and quite appropriately so, I would say. I mean, if you're going to provide firm capacity, provide firm capacity. If it's not firm capacity, you shouldn't be allowed to bid. And guess what's happened? Those generators, those owners of capacity, are now facing somewhat higher risks, and they're incurring costs to fix the problems that they used to have with being able to provide, to meet their capacity, to provide capacity in other seasons of the year. So, for instance, a lot of the combined cycle plant owners are going out and investing in dual fuel firing and retrofitting, investing in the retrofits they need to invest in to be able to switch from natural gas to distillate for short periods of time, if need be, to meet their capacity obligations. And what's happened? You started to see clearing prices in the capacity markets slowly rising. And of course, predictably, politicians in the states are complaining about it. And, the same politicians who want to impose non-bypassable charges on customers to pay for new firm pipeline capacity to come into New England. But when the prices in the capacity market rise because capacity providers are finding cheaper ways to solve that problem, they complain about it. But anyway, that's what happens. You impose these additional obligations on capacity providers for whatever reason, if it's to meet more stringent performance obligations or to meet more stringent carbon restrictions. The cost of providing capacity to the market goes up, and for the capacity the market needs, it will pay more for it.
Great, and one last question to wrap up. The AESO is considering one capacity price for all of the province. With the transmission and distribution charges currently representing over 85% of our bills, wouldn't it make more sense to incent capacity to be built near load centers and in effect introduce some healthy competition into the regulated transmission business? What is the justification for keeping one capacity price for the whole network?
Well, I'm not well versed in the robustness of the Alberta transmission network and whether or not there are structural constraints, structural congestion points inside Alberta that would justify creating fixed zonal zones for the capacity auction. There are locational considerations in both the PJM and the AESO New England capacity market because there are multiple structural congestion points across their footprints that mean that capacity in one location will have more value than capacity in another location because there's a constraint And if you're on the right side of the constraint, you should get paid more than being on the wrong side of the constraint. And they have, and generators also have access to financial transmission rights, actively traded financial transmission rights market that's run by the system operators to manage their exposure to real-time risk in the event that the basis blows out between the zone they're trying to sell into and the zone where they're located. Whether Alberta is in a situation at the moment where there are no real structural constraints, where it really is, in practice, essentially a copper plate system, then there's no underlying economic or market design rationale for imposing at the moment locational considerations in the capacity market. But unless it's really grossly overbuilt, it's likely that there will be a justification for that in the future at some point. And there's no question that where there is locational value to capacity, the capacity market should have zones. Every capacity market that's been implemented so far reflects that principle. And if you look at the market in Scandinavia, the Nordic market in Scandinavia doesn't have a capacity market, but they do have zones, locational pricing, and it would apply if and when they do adopt a capacity market. And the way their zones work is that they have what's called market splitting, which is not wildly different from the fixed zones that AESO New England and New York AESO in PJM has. It's actually fairly similar to what New York AESO has. But basically what happens in the Scandinavian market is that on any given day at any given hour, there may be one price across all of the Nordic market. And the next hour, if congestion emerges, you could see the market split between one part of the Nordic market and another part. And I think there are you could end up seeing as many as 8 or 9 zones across the Nordic market if capacity has emerged, and if congestion has emerged. And they're effectively split zones, effectively set zones, because when the market splits, it's allowed to split along what are known structural congestion points on the system. It's just that rather than having a situation like in AESO New England and PJM, where you have one energy price across the whole footprint, and then you impose price differentials based on, in the form of network charges, congestion charges, to reflect the difference in value between generation being in one zone versus another. In the Nordic market, they just simply have moments when the energy price differentiates, and other moments when there is no difference between energy prices. So basically the bottom line is, again, to the extent that there is real value to being in one place versus another as capacity, absolutely there should be multiple zones. To the extent that it really is in practice a copper plate system, which would be surprising to me, but it's possible. For the moment, while you might want to set up the zones, you probably won't see any difference in value.
Great. Well, Mike, we've reached our extra half an hour, and we've actually gotten through all the questions folks had submitted.
Right.
So I think we'll wrap up now. Just wanted to say thanks to you, Mike, for joining us, and thanks to everybody who joined to hear the presentation. We will be making the recording available tomorrow, and we'll send around the slides as well. So if there's things that you guys want to go back to, or other folks that you want to share it with, please do that. And thanks all for joining, and have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye.